All right, welcome back to the third part of One Man's Faith today. We're looking at the book of Job, and right now we're looking at the situation. I was reading a commentary, and it gave five lessons from this book. And number one, that God is sovereign. Okay, I agree with God is sovereign. Yes, he's sovereign over our suffering, but he doesn't use our suffering against us. Number two was that God permits Satan to come into our lives and do horrible things to us. No. And yes, technically, yes, he permits. However, it's not that he gives him permission. Okay? Satan comes into our lives and wreaks havoc because we step over the line that God has given us, and that is his word. That's another good reason why we need to know what his word says. We open the door when we step over that line, and that door allows Satan to come in. It's kind of the law of sin and life. That's not exactly what I wanted to say, but as long as we stay within the guidelines that God has given us, we have his protection. When we step over that line, then we open the door to allow the adversary to come into our lives and affect us. Okay? We'll look at that a little bit more. Number three, he means to prove our faith and purify our lives through the suffering. Really, I think is what, through the suffering. To prove our life. I don't agree with that, because the type of suffering that Job went through was physical suffering. Physical things happened to him. It was the loss of everything. That to me is not God. It's not God. Now, all things work together for good to those who love the Lord, yes, but God doesn't start it, nor do I believe he allows it unless we step over the line to where that door is open, and then he can come in. He proves our faith through faith actions, not through suffering. Suffering doesn't prove your faith. Listen, suffering does not improve your faith. The Word of God improves your faith. And yes, when you go through a suffering, you've got to learn to walk in faith. But that's because you're going through it, not because God put it in front of you. Okay? God tests things like Abraham. He says, go and sacrifice your son. He only did that because he knew, and Hebrews tells us this, that if he had killed his son, God would have had to have raised him up because of the promise of the covenant. So we cannot look at Job for this. Number four, in the end, he will make it good. Excuse me. In the end, he will make it good either in this life or in the next. That's like saying, well, he died, therefore he had healing. No. Yes, because you die, you're not going to suffer anymore. But God doesn't use death to bring correction to our lives. Whatever you go through, you can make it through by faith. It's not either in this life or in the next. We don't need faith after we die. It's as simple as that. You're not going to need faith. You're going to be in the presence of the God if you've accepted him as Lord. If you haven't, faith isn't going to help you anyway. So, all things can work together for good. Yes, that part is true. But it's not in this life or in the life to come. Number 5, I agree with. Satan does not have the last word in the lives of God's people. Now, we sometimes think he does, and we sometimes let him. But he doesn't. God has the last word of our lives, in our lives. But we've got to learn to walk in his ways. Okay? Now, let's look, because we were talking about Satan. Satan, I think, is only used, one time here. Actually, the word that's used is adversary. And that's what Satan means. It means adversary. So, starting with verse 6 of Job 1. Now there was a day when the sons of man came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to the adversary, "From where do you come?" And the adversary answered the Lord and said, "From roaming around on the earth and walking around on it." And the Lord said to the adversary, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Excuse me, I got a thing going here. "For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." Then the adversary answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him and his house and all he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Then the Lord said to the adversary, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not put forth your hand on him." And Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. You know, when we look at somebody's life and we see that they're going through something, we kind of think, "Oh, I wonder what he did wrong." Or, "Wow, man, you're going through this. God must be punishing you." Well, those are the oldest lies in history. That's not what it's about. God sometimes, some people say, "Well, God's teaching you humility. God's teaching you humility." I had a person tell me one time, "Well, I'm just suffering for Jesus." Those are wrong philosophies. If I could say this and I don't want to offend, they're lies. That's not how God operates. That's not how God operates. Listen, Job first lost everything, and then the second time that the adversary comes back to him, he allows the adversary to touch his life and brings boils. So he goes from losing everything to physical suffering. But it wasn't God that did that. It's interesting. If we'll look at this, there's several things here. It said there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came with them. Okay? Where did they go? They went into the courtroom of heaven. Listen, they went into the courtroom of heaven. We've got to understand that, excuse me a second. Let me cut my mic off. Okay, now I feel better. The Satan is called the adversary because that's what he does. He's an adversary, i.e., a lawyer. what he does is he brings accusation against you and me before God in the courtroom. Okay, let me read this to you from this is Young's Literal Translation. It says, and it's in the Old English, so bear with me. And the day is that sons of God came in to station themselves by Jehovah, and there doth came also the adversary in their midst. And Jehovah said to the adversary, Whence cometh thou? And the adversary answered Jehovah and said, From going to and fro on the land and from walking up and down on it. And Jehovah said to the adversary, Hast you set your heart against my servant Job, because there is none like him in the land? A man perfect and upright, fearing God and turning aside from evil. You see, that shows when the adversary came into the presence of God, he had on his, if he has one, a heart that says, I'm going after Job. Listen, this is what Job has done. And so it's not that God is bragging on Job saying, hey, you gotta look at my man here. No, God knew what the adversary was after and said, have you set your heart against my servant Job? Because there is none like him in the land? And the adversary said, well, yeah. But he says, listen, I can't touch him because you put this hedge around him. Okay, you see, God has protection. Yes, the protection can lift, but not because God lifts it. Not anymore. Because of covenant. Unless you break the covenant. But even then, if he lifted it, he would be breaking the covenant. And God doesn't break covenant. So we've got to see that we're under a different set of laws here on the earth than Job was. We don't even know that Job knew God. There's no indication here of that. Wow, I throw some things at you. I've got to take one more break, so let's take it. Think about that. Get a cup of coffee, and I'll be right back.